Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Everybody, my name is Jake. I'm joined by our amazing co-host, Jolie, business expert, mastermind.
Mastermind. Ooh,
Mastermind.
you know,
Uh-huh.
okay, anecdote.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I love Myers-Briggs.
Oh,
It's a
yes?
personality test, and I'm an INTJ,
Mm-hmm.
and the catchphrase or the catchword for an INTJ is mastermind.
What was mine? Mine changes, like, all the time.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what
It's
you're
not J. It's always the other
aren't
one.
you an INTF?
Is
That
it
doesn't
F? Is
sound
that
right.
the other one? I thought it was P at the end.
It is. You're right. It's
I think
P.
it's INTP.
I think you're right. It's P.
But anyway, what's the one on that? What's the tagline on INTP?
I don't know. I should know. But I haven't really done much
I
through
thought you
Myers
were an
Briggs. I
expert
know
in this.
I'm certified, which is sad because I didn't even know the last letter. But it's been a while since I've done much with it.
Hold
We'll
on.
have to bring that to the next podcast. Oh, you're
That's
gonna go look?
I'm gonna look now. We got technology.
Yeah,
People can wait. This sounds fun. This looks interesting.
I'm trying to think.
INTP. There's a line. Like I found a tagline. Oh, logician or thinker is
Thinker.
the two.
Yes, you're a thinker. That makes
The
sense.
tagline for it is we don't follow rules, we solve problems because problems don't follow rules.
That sounds like you, Jake.
What rules? Get out of here.
I could see in ancient Greek times you sitting around Socrates or one of
Oh,
the philosophers
yes.
listening and proposing all kinds of dilemmas and
I believe we
solutions. And
should tax the peasants 30% more.
I don't think that's what they did.
That's definitely what Socrates did.
Well, I thought they were philosophers. They were looking at larger.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's fair.
What's the purpose of life?
All right. Well, today, after
Mm,
that short intro there,
yeah.
we are back to a loved topic among people who listen to podcasts like ours, interviews.
I know. And it feels like we've done so much with interviews already. But like you say, that seems to be the number one either requested or listened to.
Yeah,
And
well,
so obviously
especially
there's a lot
now.
there.
I mean, most recently, I've told you about this. The job market between 2024 and 2025 throughout the year was down like three-fourths or something ridiculous. I think I mentioned that to you. So more and more people are wondering, how do I land these positions? How do
Hmm.
I get these in? And as a person who's getting interviews right now, I also think that. But
Hmm.
I think it's an interesting topic. But we aren't doing how we did it before. We're talking about how do you answer the questions? How do
Right.
you do that? We're talking more in the direction of like the anatomy of an interview,
Hmm.
both understanding, because I believe knowledge is power, right? I think a lot of people do.
Hmm.
And I think, one, we can cover things like what is the interviewer doing? Like, what is their goal in an interview,
Hmm.
which varies position to position, but having that insight as an interviewee would help, right? In
Hmm.
knowing what are they looking for. But also, outside of the interview,
Hmm.
your etiquette, the way you communicate with them professionally through things like emails to set up interviews, and even after an interview, what are the best
Hmm.
steps to take?
Well, and I think so. It's kind of interesting. I'm retired. I know we talked about that, I think, in the last couple. Very happy to be retired. And my youngest child is a freshman in college, and she is now interviewing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she had a great summer internship, but it was kind of a friends and family program, so there wasn't a complicated interview process. But now that she's wanting to get college jobs, she's looking at fellowships and different things this coming summer. She's interviewing, and I can remember over Christmas as she was, talking about the different jobs she was going to look into or opportunities she was going to look into. I don't know if they're jobs because some of them aren't paid, but that was one of her bigger stressors was, what am I supposed to do? How do I prepare? And so maybe we could start with that,
Yeah,
and then break down some of the details.
for sure.
We had to close the door in case there's, I don't know if you'll be able to edit that out, but
I'll try my best.
okay, there's noise going on. So that was one of her bigger stressors. And it was interesting for me because I had to look at this at a slightly different perspective.
Yeah.
And she I don't want to oversell this because she might listen to this, and I don't want her to feel embarrassed or feel like I'm sharing something that's really personal. But she was really stressed about it. She was
Mm-hmm.
very concerned, and she's not one that has like panic attacks, but she got very emotive, and it felt overwhelming, which I can understand because I can feel that way too. Now, in a professional setting, I never ever let that show, but in my personal life, even like I've been editing videos and stuff recently, and I feel overwhelmed because I don't know how to do it. It seems so complicated. And I think so many times we focus on the importance of the outcome of the process versus kind of taking a step back and breaking down the anatomy. So when you presented this as a topic to me, I thought, you know, the most important thing I think when you think about the anatomy of the interview isn't just about, the questions that you're going to be asked, um, and answering the questions and being professional. I mean, that's all important, but there's so much that goes into prep before the interview.
Mm-hmm.
And so with her as an example, and I think a lot of your listeners would be similar. They're probably on the younger side, maybe don't have a whole lot of interview experience. What I worked on with her first was there are going to be some stories that you get that, or some questions that you get that are the same no matter what type of a job that you're interviewing for. They're going to be looking for how do you deal with conflict, how do you deal with unexpected occurrences,
Yeah.
how do you deal with stress, um, are you mature enough to accept that you've made mistakes and how do you deal with mistakes? And then they're going to ask you specific stuff about the actual technical knowledge of the job, but they're really looking for a profile, right? And so one of the things that I focused on for her, and one of the jobs she's been doing just a marathon of interviews, and talking to her yesterday after I think her fifth interview for different things, she was so much calmer going into it. She called me while she was waiting to do the interview, and there wasn't any of that emotive stress that
Mm-hmm.
she'd had as we prepped. And then I said, well, call me as soon as you're done. And she called me and she kind of rehashed it and she felt really good about the interview. Now, we don't know whether or not she's gotten these very competitive positions yet, but that's not really the point. And I was so excited to hear her say yesterday, I'm getting the experience. I'm putting myself out there. I'm doing something that makes me really uncomfortable. I don't know if I'm going to get this coveted residential assistant position or if I'm going to get this fellowship or I'm going to get this summer program through the college. But I've tried and I'm getting better every time I do an interview, which is an incredibly mature way to think about it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's hard. I've been rejected. And this is one of the things I said to her when we sat down over Christmas. I said, I have had many different jobs in my career. And I interviewed just like, the 20 something people today are interviewing. I interviewed for lots of jobs. And in the beginning, it was hard. I didn't always get every job that I interviewed for. And then as I got more mature and I had experience, let's say into my 30s and even 40s, I typically didn't have to do a lot of internal interviews. I was more, maybe you did like a socialization, but I was kind of appointed to jobs based on the companies I was in. But, even my last job that I took in mid 22, I had to go through an interview process.
Mm-hmm.
And I was 50 and I was still nervous. You never lose that nervousness. So that's one of the things I want to say going into how do you prep for the interview is everyone is nervous. I don't care if people tell you they aren't. We are all nervous because you're putting yourself out there. You're a little bit vulnerable. You're having to sell yourself. And many of us don't like doing that. We're not comfortable doing that. I always had to get into the mindset of this is my time to be a little arrogant, to talk about how good I am, to sell myself, to tell my story. And many of us aren't either comfortable doing that or we're not good at doing that. And I think I'm going to be a little gender specific here. I think especially for young female professionals, because we've been brought up to be a little bit humble, to talk about the team. And it's true, nothing ever gets done as an individual. And you have to balance that in those interviews of a little bit of arrogance and a little bit of cockiness with, I did it as a team. I wouldn't have gotten there without my team. But for most folks that are interviewing for their first job, it's not going to be really team focused because they're not interviewing for a leadership
Yeah.
position. One of the things I worked on with my daughter was that I sat down and said, let's first go to YouTube, as silly as it sounds, and let's just watch people that made a little clip
About it.
about interviewing for your specific job, being an RA at a big college.
Mm-hmm.
And we watched 2 or 3 of those together. And the purpose there was, one, to listen to their story, 2, to kind of get an idea of what the questions were, because no job is going to tell you these are the exact questions we ask. And 3, I kind of wanted her to feel a little bit more like she's not unique. Everybody's gone through this.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first things that we saw, one of the very first videos, which was a good video, is it was a young girl, maybe a couple years older than my daughter. And she was talking about, you're just going to have to tell a story. You just have to make something up. If you don't have that experience, you're going to have to make something up. I told my daughter, don't make up something, but you can find a story or an experience that will still answer the question. So we kind of put that aside and we had the types of questions we thought she would be asked. And then we sat down and said, okay, what experiences have you had that would give a good story about how you deal with that? And from there, once you have the experience, then you can figure out, well, how do I answer the question? And I want to insert my experience. You don't just want to say, well, this one time and then go into the experience. Someone asked you a question, how do you deal with conflict? You would say something like, especially in this like residential assistant, you're dealing with students who are not getting along, they're away from home, they've been a senior at high school, and we all know what it was like to be a senior and then go in and you're the bottom dredges of a freshman in college. You're no longer the big man on campus, so to speak. You don't know anybody. Everybody's more knowledgeable than you. And you're coming together with other young people who have probably been exactly where you were and come from lots of different backgrounds that are different, maybe even different parts of the country. So they have different biases and different expectations. And so I think that it's important to, in that particular position as an RA, to say, well, how would I deal with conflict? And so my daughter didn't really have a good story for that or a good answer for that. She kind of had a textbook answer. And I said, that's not bad. That's a great place to start. But let's think about a time recently that you've had conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And she struggled with that. Now, as her mother, I knew of experiences that she had had at school already. She gave me, as these things were happening, we were having conversations. So she described a time when she went to visit a couple of her friends just before the Christmas holiday, so very recent. She walked in and the 2 roommates were in a horrible fight, and they were, in their bad places, let's say. My daughter, being a little bit of a smoother, kind of went in and said, okay, well, let's pause for a minute and let's figure out where we're both coming from. And one of the things that she was able to identify in that moment was they were building off of each other, and they're very competitive, and they're in the same program, and then they're in this thing called the Scholars Program, which is even more competitive. And so they were feeling like they had to one up each other and get ahead of each other, and they were spinning out of control of, being a freshman in college. Well, now I've got to know exactly what I'm going to do in 4 years. And the great thing about my daughter is she was able to take a step back and say, I think, that's not a problem for today. Today, let's just worry about what classes we're going to schedule. We're working on our classes in the fall. Let's just kind of do that. And so she had this great story of how she inserted herself between 2 people that were in the midst of great conflict. And so I said, and what did you do? So now break down what did you do, because that is your answer to the question, what would you do if you were presented with 2 students that, were in a conflict? And I think that's great advice to every listener, is to say, think about the question that you might get asked. You need to prepare the questions that you want to respond to. And those questions should be based on other people who have interviewed for similar positions. Then you want to say, don't just say, well, this is what I would say. Don't ever make something up. I mean, that's not genuine. You'll end up in positions that are not suited for you. If you're not the right person for the job, don't pretend like you are, because you will be miserable. And then I think in a couple of sessions, we're going to talk about when do you cut loose and move out of a job.
Hmm.
And you don't want to be there because you put yourself into a position that you were not well suited for.
Yeah.
And so that's what you need to do, is you need to think about those examples. And then she was able to sit down and take notes of what she did in that circumstance, how she kind of identified that they were in conflict, identified that they were escalating each other, broke it down to its simplest form and said, is that really something that you need to decide today as you're thinking about next semester's classes? Or should we just focus on this for now?
Hmm.
Now, there's a lot more to it. I've simplified that a great deal. And I'm not saying that, she walked in and suddenly everything was perfect, because that's not how the real world is.
Hmm.
But she was a positive influence in that moment to kind of break down the tensions of the situation. You got a couple of young women who probably, were forced together to be roommates, and that maybe isn't going so well, because that happens. I had a terrible freshman roommate myself. So I get that. That just happens. And she probably said I was the worst roommate ever. But I think that's one of the things that you want to do as you're preparing, is you want to sit down and you want to think about real life experiences that you can talk to, because it's always more genuine. And if there are follow-up questions, you're not struggling. And that's always, as an interviewer, what I could zoom in on. If somebody gave me a story or an answer that was too good to be true, I would start to drill down into that, and you could tell they made it up. And, there's a little bit of, okay, well, they're creative, they're trying to come at it, but I'd say, but they don't have that experience. So I don't want you to be disingenuous and say you have an experience that you don't have. So I think that's really important. I think the next piece, once you've identified, okay, what is my response to these questions that I've identified, and you have your examples, then you want to build your story. And that's what I focused on with my daughter. Is I said, she had several great stories that talked about her character, talked about how she wants to be inclusive, how she saw somebody that felt like they were left out, how she brought them in. She had a wonderful example of a situation that I said, now you could pull this out, and that'll be a story that you want to share, and it will fit a dozen different questions. And it was a story of someone who wasn't getting texts as part of this friend group and this scholars group, took it personally because they are going through gender reassignment, felt like people were signaling them out because of that. And at the end of the day, it was as simple as everybody in this chat is on Apple and this person has a Samsung. It was that simple. But instead of, feeding this person or ignoring this person saying, I don't want to get involved in it, my daughter reached out and said, I think you just get left out because of this. Let's figure out how we can set you up so you can be text. You can always be in the text, because you guys know this better than me. I don't understand it, but apparently that text chain between those different types of devices sometimes is a
It's
challenge
mostly Apple being
to anything
petty.
else. But she was able to do that. And then she went out of her way and like went and bought brownie stuff, and they made brownies together with this person and really started to include this person in things. And I was absolutely shocked yesterday when she told me if she doesn't get the RA position, she's going to room with this person.
Hmm.
And as a parent, nothing would make me happier to think that this is somebody who was feeling vulnerable, probably a little delicate, coming from the world that they had lived in to a new world, feeling like they were signaled out. They weren't in this case, but I'm sure that they have experiences of being signaled out in the past. And yet she was able to, because of who her character is, I'm not saying I'm this person, but she was able to bring them in. And now she has like a really good friend that they want to room together. And I look at that and say, that is such a positive influence. This is why my daughter's really interested, I think, in human rights and civil rights and things like that. That's what she wants to go into, is law in those spaces, because that could have been a terrible situation, or people could have just ignored this person, said it's not my problem, it's not my problem, and that never would have resolved it. And this person could have actually been, worst case scenario, somebody who says, I can't go to school here because I don't feel included, I don't feel valued, and I think that's sometimes where those bitter feelings come from is, well, it must be because I'm going through gender reassignment, when it truly was a situation of you're just on a different device.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's an example of how you want to think about those stories. And that's a story that you might want to insert into, well, how do you work in a team? How do you break down conflict? What do you do in emotional situations? You could take that story and spin it lots of different ways. So my advice is you prepare. You'll never know exactly what questions you're going to be asked, but you could think about those stories in which you shine,
Mm-hmm.
and we all have those, and figure out how do you tell that story. And I think then that's the fourth piece of the anatomy of the interview is you have stories that you want to share. They are important to who you are. You need to make sure you fit those stories into the interview. And you do that by answering the question saying, "Well, let me give you an example of how I did that." And that shouldn't be just one story. You should have 3 or 4. I think my daughter and I prepared 5 different stories.
Mm-hmm.
And what I said to her was, you don't want to force all of those stories into the interview, because now it looks like you're not following the interviewer's guide, their lead, which will be the next piece I talk about. But you want to make sure there's at least a couple of those that you get in. So prepare your answer and your story around that to be like, okay, if I get asked a challenge conflict, if I get asked dealing with difficult people conflict, if I get, whatever that question is, this is how I would answer it, and this is how I would bring in this story. And I think for most people, your story would check several boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really important. You can't prepare perfectly for every question, but you can know what is the story I want to share. When I was working with young professionals at one of my huge multinationals, I had all of these, they were called, basically, they were not interns, but they were in early career development plans. And I seemed to always be assigned as a mentor to all the HR people. So there were times I had, over a dozen of
Mm-hmm.
these young professionals that I was mentoring. And I did like it, but you can't do a good job when you have that many.
Yeah, when you have that many.
Um, but at the end of the day, one of the things that I would always prep them on is you need to have an elevator speech. And I think most people know what that means, but in case you don't, it means if you were in an elevator with the CEO or the head of a department or somebody that this is your one opportunity to talk to them, and they turn to you and they say, "Hey, Jake, what do you do?"
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to say, "Oh, I'm in finance and I work for Bob." You want to have your elevator speech. And
Mm-hmm.
that elevator speech should be about 30 seconds, but it should be aimed to impress. And that's another piece. When you first get into an interview, one of the initial questions is going to be a little bit ambiguous, like, tell me about yourself or give me a little bit about your background. And you guys have heard me say this before. Please don't read your resume. Just, I mean, if whoever's interviewing didn't take time to read your resume, then you're not going to have a great interview regardless, probably. But don't just read your resume. Think about what your elevator speech is. And on your resume, you usually have like some kind of professional tagline that you put up there. Take that and make it your own. Make it a language. Practice it so it's like a prepared speech. Think back to like when you had to memorize Julius Caesar, or you had to memorize a speech or something for a play where you had to stand up and, regurgitate exactly what was written. Make it almost that intimate so that you know what it is. Pause, practice it in front of the mirror. Think about your inflection, because you want to sound genuine, not like you're just reading it off the page. That is going to be more impressive than anything. You've got about a minute and a half at the beginning. I mean, I've mentioned before, sometimes I'm like, 3 minutes in, I'm done with this interview.
Mm-hmm.
And I go through the motions, but I'm done with the candidate because you didn't catch me. And I'm not saying I've never had somebody catch me later, but it's very rare.
For like people that look at it a little differently, a good way to think about it is um, think about that little summary in the elevator pitch as a hook to a book
Yes, yes,
or a opening scene in a movie. You know,
yes.
it's what are you telegraphing out? What are you focusing on? What is yada 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 yada? You want to get them interested so they ask the questions so you can go into those stories that you talked about, right? You want to really lead them into the water. You don't want to
Mm-hmm.
just not do that, right? So like you said, that I like your elevator pitch metaphor that you gave, where it's like you have 30 seconds, go, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, of all of the classes I did take on resumeing and interviewing, which I didn't take many, I took one, but I had a lot of practice outside using the employment program at my college at the
Mm-hmm.
time. The most useful thing was nothing I got from that employment program, but from that one half a credit course I took, she forced everyone to do a 30-second elevator
Mm-hmm.
pitch. And it was one of the greatest experiences to practice, especially as a person myself who has pretty bad social anxiety, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things that, and I know I have a lot of peers and people like that who are on several spectrums of
Mm-hmm.
having things like autism and things like that, who also struggle with things like that. And what you want to get it down to is get it down to a practiced ABC, you know? And if you can function it as like a line of logic, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's much easier to go in and go out of it. And that's something that is worth practicing. And something kind of related to what you said about stories, that's something you can also do with skills and abilities that you
Mm-hmm.
have. I saw this really, really funny, or like around social media post of this person who had been struggling to get interviews, who, like I said, was is autistic. And what they ended up doing was they made this really funny post, which was clearly meant to make you laugh, but it is pretty good advice, which was what I've started learning to do is I've started learning to turn all my idiosyncrasies into positive spins. So he said, "Oh, I can't pay attention very long on one particular task." Well, actually, I like working in a position that gives me a varied amount of different opportunities to grow in several directions. That's a genius way to rephrase
Yes, it
that.
is.
And things like that are ways to think about, especially prepping for an interview. Because I know myself, I have, and I'm sure you're the same, right? Everyone has some flaw about their process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of the way they think, of the way they operate. How do you use that to explain why it's good? Almost is not the exact phrasing I'm looking for, but
Yeah.
how can you paint it as a positive thing
Well,
in
and
a
I
way?
think on the same note, so one of the things I prepared my daughter, and I've done it for my other child as well, and I've done it for people that have asked for help, but I think we've talked about it on this podcast, is you're going to be asked, what are your biggest developmental areas, or what are your challenges, or, what's a trait or something about yourself that you would change? And that's where you do that.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was young and growing up, you did the same thing, but you kind of were prepped on say everybody wants you to be organized and to have great time management. That was kind of the big thing back in the 90s. And so you'd say, well, I can be a little bit of a control freak when it comes to my calendar because I really like things to stay on time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I got that because I worked for a Japanese automotive company, and when the meeting started, they locked the door.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were late, you didn't get to come into the meeting. They did not let you in. You could knock and knock and knock, which you learn very quickly never to do. But there are things like that. And that's what you're saying. So, as an example with my daughter, and I'll give you an example of somebody else I just worked with not that long ago, but my daughter was like, I don't, I can't think of what my weakness is. And I said, well, think about something. And she goes, well, I think probably it's I feel awkward in social situations. I said, okay, and that's true. And you should say something that's true, but I wouldn't answer the question with that.
Don't say it like that. Yeah.
I said, so think about how you could turn that a little bit into a positive.
Mm-hmm.
And she struggled a little bit. I said, well, let me just, I'm going to throw out a couple ideas for you, and you decide which one is right for you, because I don't want you to be dishonest. But another way of saying that is, I work really well independently.
Mm-hmm.
Another way of saying that is, I'm a little hesitant when I come into new situations. It takes me just a little bit longer, perhaps, than others. But once I get going, I run with it.
Yeah.
There are ways that you can sell that. And so I think we had 4 or 5, and she picked the one. And then she and I practiced. And then I would ask her the question, and she would feed it back to me. And we did that before her first big interview just this past January. She called me, and we spent about another hour on the phone. And she would she would pose the question that she thought she would get, and she would respond to it. And coming where I come from, I'm very critical.
Mm-hmm.
and I want her to do her best, as I want all my kids and everybody I know to do their best. And so one of the things I know about myself is I don't focus on the positive first. I tend to jump to what needs to change, and then at the end with the good. Well, that's not the best psychological approach. So of course I said, that is a great answer. Here are all the things that you did well. You might want to think about changing this because that word that you used is very negative.
Mm-hmm.
And so she'd say, okay, let me try again. Now that takes a great deal of trust. And if
Mm-hmm.
you have social anxiety, even me, I don't practice well with others.
Mm-hmm.
I practice best on my own. And so
Yep.
when I would go into an interview, or even when I was doing like a board meeting or something, I would practice a dozen times before I went in exactly what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. And I would sometimes catch myself and be like, no, no, wrong. I wouldn't finish it. I would stop it. I would make a mental note and then I would go back and do it right.
Do it again.
Because if I didn't catch myself and I let that continue, I was more likely to do it in the future. So I think that practice piece, having exactly what it is you know you want to say, making sure you do have questions. Don't ever, 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 I can't say it strongly enough, leave an interview and say, well, I don't have any questions because I think I know enough
Always have a
about it.
question.
You have to have questions because it comes across as arrogant and just not well laid out. And in any type of an environment, you should always have questions.
Mm-hmm.
You should always, now, you should have, it's even okay to ask different interviewers the same question and just acknowledge it. Hey, I've asked everybody this question. I just want to make sure I'm getting the true story.
Well, and so I have an interesting comment to add to this because, well, one thing I wanted to say is one of my favorite ways to reframe something that I would say is maybe a flaw about me is that I hate, general niceties,
Mm-hmm.
like the hello, thank you. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
hate them. I hate them so much and it pisses me off. But I'm able to turn that into I value transparency
Mm-hmm.
with my team.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of my favorite spins because that sounds fantastic to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I was doing practice with my employment advisor I'm working with
He's a
to find
coach.
position coach. Thank you. When I use that phrasing, she's like, that's one of the best ways
Mm-hmm.
to rephrase
Mm-hmm.
that. But I wanted to jump on your thing that you were just talking about. Oh gosh, I've lost it now. What did you just say?
Preparing.
Preparing something.
I'm not good at practicing with others.
Yes. Okay. So thank you. Took me a minute to get
And
back on
that's not a great
course.
skill. Don't be like me. I just know that about myself.
Well, so here's the thing, right? Practice is very interesting, especially for things like interviews and questions. That's what I wanted to jump to.
Oh, question.
Questions are that's something I struggle with a lot. And it's not because I can't think of a question. It's because I study the companies
Mm-hmm.
rigorously when I get an interview. I go through their site, I look through their information, and I will find answers to the questions I would have asked, right, on their site or publicly in their if they're publicly traded, you can find it
Mm-hmm.
in their stockholder meetings that are online and stuff. So there's a lot of information you can find. And so for my first couple interviews out of college, I really struggled when that part came up because I had answered all of my questions. And to me, I always read that because I agree, it does come off as very arrogant, yada yada, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
when I never saw that as much
And
from my
not
side.
interested. It's like you're not really interested.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so something to do is one, the way I do it when I enter interviews now, I always have three general questions that I have down no matter what. Even if I know the answer to them, I write them down. One of my favorites is what is the work environment like? What is the culture of the teams? And how do people operate with each other and stuff like that? Because it's very useful to ask, in my opinion, social based questions, because
Mm.
those are the things you're not going to easily find. Or ask very specific questions about the company. I interviewed with a publishing group that had this great charity thing they did every year. And it was connected to their main thing, but you couldn't learn much about it. And that's something that, well, one, you could have asked just for interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
But two, I framed it very much as this is something I think is amazing that you
Mm-hmm.
guys do, and I would really like to hear more about it. Can you tell me how that operates in your day to day? How do
Mm-hmm.
you guys work with that? And things like that, specifically about the company,
Mm-hmm.
I've experienced that they are very receptive to those questions,
Mm-hmm.
especially about the company.
Well, and it shows an interest for
It shows
sure.
that you've researched and looked, you
So
know?
here is something that's really interesting too, and
Yeah.
it's on the same lines of what you're saying as far as the culture. It is okay to ask those types of questions of multiple people because I can't tell you how many times I have actually removed myself from the process
Mm-hmm.
because the stories don't match.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, it's hard right now when you're out there looking for a position, especially if you don't have a position and you're hungry to start your professional career. It's often hard to remember you're interviewing them too.
Mm-hmm.
And there is one company, I won't say who, but if you research it, it's probably still out there. I remember interviewing, I was interviewing for a fairly high level HR director position. And I was very interested in this because I was going to be involved in this major acquisition. And that was at the time where my passion was. That's what I thought I wanted to do long term. And I found as I was doing what you were doing, so it was recently enough that I could go out and research. I found that they had this tagline kind of buried deep in one of their websites, and it said, "There's no right way to do the wrong thing."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, now again, this was like 2005, probably. I thought, that's interesting. What an interesting thing to say. And I had a particular thought of what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty far into the interview. I did my screen and then I did an interview like with the local group. And then it was time to go to the corporate group because as you interview for higher positions, you're interviewing more and you're interviewing higher. Sometimes you have to go back 5 and 6 times even. And I go and I interview first with like the VP level. So even above my, because I was a director reporting to like a senior director who reported to a VP, who reported to a president, who reported to the C. It's all
Yeah, yeah.
lots of
Long
layers,
list, long
lots of
list.
layers. And so I asked not the group I interviewed with as peers, not the group I interviewed with as my boss, but that next level up. I said, I'm really curious, what does that mean to you? And this person said to me, I've been here for 30 years and I've never heard of that. And they were a little bit rude and dismissive.
Hmm.
And I thought, and it was a he even said, where did you even see that? And I said, what was on your website on this particular page? And it's over here. And he goes, that doesn't mean anything to us. I've never heard of that before. And he was really dismissive. And I thought, well, that's odd.
Yeah.
One, I thought it was odd because if I were him and I wasn't at his level yet, I didn't have his experience yet or anything like that, that's not how I would have responded to it. I would have said, well, that's really interesting. I don't know what that means. I'm going to have to go out and look at that. That would have been my approach, right? Not that my approach is right,
Mm-hmm.
but I thought, have I hit a nerve? There was just something a little off in that interaction. So then when I'm interviewing with the CHRO, we go through the interview and he's a very unpleasant person. I'll just say that. It was a
Okay.
very
All
unpleasant
right.
interview. Um, so basically, at the end, that was one of my questions. I said, I found now I changed my question a little bit. Instead of just asking the question, what does that mean to you? I said, I found this quote on one of the websites, and it was in relation to this. I said, I've asked a couple of people, never say who, and I only asked one, so a little bit of a fudge. I said, but I've asked a couple of people during this process, what did that mean to them? And it seems like it's kind of obscure. And I remember so clearly, he took off his glasses and he stuck one of the little ears in his face and he's looking at me, right? And I'm very uncomfortable. And he goes, it's interesting that you cued in on that.
What?
And I said, it just struck me as an odd thing to have. And it was meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
It had meaning to me. I said, so it sounds like you're aware of it. And he goes, yes. And I said, I'm just curious, what do you think it means? And he said, what does it mean to you? And
Deflecting the
yes,
questions.
this was bizarre, okay?
That's really weird.
And so I said, well, to me, what it means is we always want to do the right thing. That we're not going to compromise. We're not going to settle. It's always about doing the right thing. So the right thing for the customer, the right thing for the employee. That's what it meant to me. And he goes, well, I can see how you would read that. And that was it. He was done.
That's weird.
Now,
That's really weird.
what's interesting is that I went ahead and took that job.
Mm-hmm.
About 6 months into the job, I thought to myself, these are some of the most unethical people I have ever worked with. Now, since then, I would say I've met more unethical people. But at that point in
That's pretty
time in my
weird.
life, I thought, wow, that's interesting. And I ended up staying there about 2 years, which was the minimum amount of time you should stay somewhere before you. But I couldn't wait to leave because I felt like it was something that someone had put out because it sounded good, but it wasn't their culture. And to me, that was misleading.
Uh-huh.
And the fact that they even discounted it, I'm surprised they even hired me. To be honest with you, I would guess that the CHRO would have been like, I don't think you should hire her, but do whatever you want to. And then I got hired lower. But those are little things, and that's a story. I know I digress in these stories, but if I had been a little bit more mature,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe if I wasn't as hungry to move, because I was ready to move, I think I would give the advice now. I would step back and say that probably wasn't the right fit. And from those couple of interactions, I knew it wasn't the right fit, but I went anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't regret going because that job then led to another bigger job. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
all of the moves that you make, whether you think that they're a misstep or not, they take you down the path that take you somewhere. And I would never have gotten the mergers and acquisitions experience that I had gotten there anyplace else. That was a once in a lifetime opportunity. So, you do focus on that. And I've taken other jobs that even in the time, I took one job that I was only there a year, believe it or not. I knew when I took the job, it was a mistake. And I left and went right back to the company I had worked with before because it was a mistake for my family. It was a mistake for me, and it wasn't a good cultural fit. And we're all going to make those mistakes, and that's okay. The sooner, and we'll talk about that later, when do you say enough is enough? The sooner that you recognize that. But the reason I insert this here is, getting the job might not be the best outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to be able to figure out, as hungry as you may be, is this something that I can live with or not? Because I think it's a slow fade once you start to compromise your principles.
Mm-hmm.
And I made that mistake many times. I have to say, looking back where I sit today, none of them do I have huge regrets now over, but I probably come across a little goody two shoes, and I hate to be that way because believe me, I've done things I'm not necessarily proud of in the overall scheme of my career, because sometimes you have to make sacrifices, you have to make compromises, but I don't want anyone else to have to live through the choices that I made. I'd like people to feel empowered to stand up and say no.
Well, it's really interesting because just a small aside before I kind of want to talk about the communications around interviews because I think that's
Yep,
interesting.
yep.
But before we get there, I did want to note something intriguing based on what you were going with is Gen Z I'm sure you've read the articles. There's and this is saying it as I would guess probably one of the oldest in Gen Z by
Mm-hmm.
technicality. I was like on the edge depending how you cut it.
Right.
But it's really interesting because me and all the people I know are around the same age. And it's really funny because we always talk about, man, Gen Z is so weird.
Yes, you
Because they
guys are
do
different.
weird things. Even to me, who is part of it, I think Gen Z is weird because they do weird things. But I wanted to talk about the ethics and morality stuff you were
Mm-hmm.
talking about. Because I do feel like, and I am one of this too, and I think I've mentioned before in last episode when you asked me about positions I didn't end up going with and stuff like that, is that they are incredibly ethically bound, if you've noticed.
Mm.
There are so many people in the Gen Z world, or at least the generation going into jobs and stuff, who will outright prefer to not have a job if it goes against their morale or their ethics internally. And that's really weird
Well, this is what,
on a large
yeah.
scale at least.
So I have a very strong opinion about that,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
a
yeah.
little bit different than what I was saying. So this is what I would say. You have to be very, in my opinion, ethics are situational.
Mm-hmm.
When I was young, when I was, say, 23 to 27, 28, I did not understand that. The ethics are situational,
Mm-hmm.
but they are.
Yeah.
what is right for one person may not be right for somebody else.
Agreed.
And one of the very first lessons I learned in HR is I would rather be consistent
Mm-hmm.
than fair. Because being fair to one person is by definition not being fair to somebody else.
What's the hold on. There's a word for it. It's you don't want to treat people well, there was like it's a pretty common phrase online at least. It's equality is not um whatever. There's another word for it, like equity or something. Basically, they gave this example of there's three people at a ballpark watching a ball game, and they give every single person the exact same box to stand on to look over the fence. Well, the same box doesn't work for
That's
everybody.
right.
You have to give some people more boxes and some people less
Mm-hmm.
boxes to make it equitably or something is the word.
Equality is not equity
Yeah,
or
something
something
like
like
that.
that.
It's
Okay, I
something
haven't
along the
heard
lines of
that.
that where treating people equally is not the same as giving everyone an equal
Well,
chance
and
at something,
I
and
would
that's interesting.
yeah, I would agree with that. Now I will say that even in business, and I many times gave this coaching to leaders,
Hmm.
is you can't always be fair. You're so obsessed with being fair to her or fair to him or fair to them that you are treating them differently
Hmm.
than you're treating others. And it's okay to treat them differently. And let me
Hmm.
give you an example. This is a great one that is not that old. Somebody came and they said, I have this guy working for me, and he's a different demographic than me, but he's a hard worker. He's never had issues before. Blah 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 blah. And this thing came up, and I want to make an exception for him. And my first question is, why are you even telling me that he's a different demographic from you? Why does that play into it? And this person said, here's why. I have 3 or 4 other employees who have asked for the same exception, and I have not done it because either they come to work late, they're not getting their work done, their quality isn't good. There's all these reasons why I have said no.
Hmm.
This is my like benchmark employee. He does everything great. I mean, he's wonderful. But I've already been accused of like playing favorites to him
Hmm.
because he's protected.
Yeah.
And so what I said to them was, okay, I understand the sensitivity now because I'm always my hockles go up, right? Or that's not the right word. I get concerned when you throw a demographic at me. I don't want to know their demographic. Half the time I don't want to know their name.
Yeah.
I don't want to know anything
You
about it.
don't this is actually an important social knowledge to have. Even if you don't think you do, everyone has a bias.
We all have unconscious
It
bias.
doesn't matter
Yes.
whether you think you do or not.
You do. You
You
do.
always do.
And we always have a bias towards people like us, whatever
Hmm.
that likeness is. But at any rate, so he tells me this story, and let's say this guy's name's Charlie, and this is Susie and Bob and whatever. And so I said, so what you need to do is make sure, one, you're not always making an exception for Charlie.
Hmm.
But if there are extraordinary circumstances, then you just tell the group, look, Charlie is the top performer. Charlie nailed that sales call. Charlie's done this. Charlie's done that. If you do that, I'll make the same exception for you.
Hmm.
And if you want to come and talk to me individually about what you need to do to have an exception, come and talk to me. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. You don't want to compare them to Charlie because they're all
Yeah.
unique and special. And maybe Charlie delivered more in sales because he just happens to have the right geographical area of the country. There's things you have to take into account. But you can't say I'm not going to do it because people will accuse me
Hmm.
of favoritism. If it is the time to make an exception,
Hmm.
right? And that's, I think for leaders we struggle with that. And I think we've digressed a little bit from the concept here, but this was ethics. The problem with, for me, and I'm a Gen Xer, as we've talked about, sometimes with the Gen Zers is, and I'm sure the generation before me, the boomers of the world, although my parents were from the silent generation, but I'm sure they thought the same thing because I can remember my mom and I conflicting quite a bit when I came back from grad school right before I got married. And I would say something and she'd say, well, that's what you believe now. Or she'd tell me things like, well, your tastes will change, or this will happen, or that will happen. And it irritated me,
Hmm.
as it probably irritates all young people.
Yeah.
But she wasn't wrong. And
Hmm.
as I've gotten older, I've realized I probably came across as a know it all, a little bit cocky because I'd gone to college and nobody else had gone to college. I had my own internal ethics that I would never compromise.
Hmm.
And as you interact with the world, and as your world becomes a little bit bigger, which is what happens when you get out there on your own, you begin to realize that what you think is right may not be right.
Well,
And
and
I do think Z needs to be open to that.
it's again, it's a tale as old as time. It's gonna happen.
Yeah, we all
Every single
change. All of
generation,
us
we're
change.
not going to be able to change. Now, every generation always does bring something new,
Yes,
and that's
yes.
good to realize too. Where that line is very important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because with some generations, it's different than others. But digress. Let's move on quickly to communication,
Okay.
right, around interviews, because this is something I think, even with people I've talked to, they either get interviews or whatever, but a lot of them are really bad about communicating around interviews,
Mm-hmm.
right? The going into it and going out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And something that I was taught but also had some level of experience doing already at that point is you really want to set yourself up for success in the interview, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both before and after. And I know this because when you look at it from like, I'll give an example. You have to apply to this position. To apply, you have to send an email with your information, right? And then they'll give you an interview time. When you send that email, right? Let's say you're required to send a resume and a cover letter, right? You attach them. Some people would just one line, bang, bang, send.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that,
Mm-hmm.
but is that your best foot
Mm-hmm.
forward? Is the question to ask. Would it be better, hypothetically, and this is just my opinion, maybe you disagree. I found it works better if you have a short couple sentence intro
Mm-hmm.
about yourself. Maybe not your career summary or your career goals that's on your resume, but say, hey, my name is X. I am applying to this position. I have attached my relevant documentation. I'm really looking forward to this because, and then give a little bit of information
Mm-hmm.
about it. I think my experience in X will be
Mm-hmm.
helpful,
Mm-hmm.
yada, yada, yada. Now, don't write everything about your resume on there, but write a little bit of a, like we mentioned before, that hook.
Mm-hmm.
You know, get them interested in reading your resume. Don't just say, here is my attached documents. I am applying to
Well, and I think
X role.
I absolutely agree with everything that you said, and I will also go back to I too am not so good at formalities,
Mm-hmm,
and I don't know if it's because I've lived all over. Because I think back to like where I came from. I've come from the Midwest, and I never would have years ago not started an email with good afternoon or good morning, and I
mm-hmm,
never would have not said something like regards or looking forward to this or something. And maybe it's because I worked for huge multinationals. Maybe it's because I lived on the West Coast. I lived on the East Coast. And it was get to the point. And so I often have to remind myself I'm sending out an email, whether it was internal or external, to pause and make sure I would start with the salutation and I would make sure I put in the closing
mm-hmm,
because I'm not good at it. Now, if it's informal and it's somebody that you've interacted with 1,000 times and you're just going back on a quick email, it's an email chain and you're just responding, you're probably okay.
mm-hmm,
But those initial interactions, you need to make sure that you do that. And it is because of an unconscious bias. You don't know that the person that you're interacting with is wired the way you're wired.
mm-hmm,
Those subtle niceties might be really important. I know when I moved down to the South 7, 8 years ago, I would walk up to a salesperson and say, "Can you tell me where something is?" And I did that for a while, and I never thought anything about it. And one person said, "Well, good morning to you too." And I thought, wow, I didn't even like acknowledge them.
Didn't
I
clock the
acted
good
like they were a
morning.
kiosk, and I just went in and Amazoned it, right? Or Googled it or whatever. And so that's very important.
Mm-hmm,
And then to your point, those little subtleties, you're right, you don't want to write paragraphs, but a couple of short sentences, they may not even read them. You don't know. They may be somebody who's like, I don't have time for this, but it shows an investment
mm-hmm,
and it shows that you understand how to engage with other people,
mm-hmm.
not that you can engage with your phone or chat GBT or
Well,
something like
it's
that.
funny because we even mentioned earlier, I hate
Mm-hmm.
general subtleties generally, but let me be clear. You can still be nice and have those things even without. Now, this wouldn't be the case in corporate communication or anything like that, but in day to day, you can also, like, as you mentioned, just things like a wave.
Yes.
significantly. I know myself, I do this little like 3 finger wave where I go like
Mm-hmm.
hello with my little hands talking or whatever I do. And that's also helpful. And
Mm-hmm.
I've unconsciously done that once or twice at in-person interviews. And I actually, during those interviews, have been asked, "Why do you do that?" And I'm like, "That's my little greeting, my little weird subtlety. I didn't mean to." And they actually thought it was cool or like goofy and
Laughed at
fun
it.
and gave me personality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't mean to do it in those interviews, but I do
Mm-hmm.
think that's interesting because it's something that just small little things like that, even if they're goofy, subconscious, whatever, very important. And I think in the same regards, post interview,
Yes.
a very important thing that I've seen nobody really, even my coach didn't, until I asked, didn't say anything about it, um, is I think it should be customary to either, if you know the hiring manager or have a contact or something, follow up and say, thank you for the interview.
It
I
is
really
critical. It
appreciated
sets
it.
you apart.
I think it's so, so important. But even, like I said, the coach I talked to, and maybe they were going to bring it up, maybe I asked too early, I don't know. But they didn't bring it up until I asked,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm like, I do that? Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. And they were
Well,
like, yeah, yeah, that's really, really good. But a lot of people don't do that, you
well, and
know?
what's funny is like back in my day, back in the
Back
1492,
in
um,
1971.
you always did it, but everything was in person. You didn't do phone interviews. Even screens were in person,
Hmm.
and you sent a letter because you didn't have email. I
Well,
mean,
now screening is
yeah,
phone calls, but
but there was still a protocol. You always had that. You always had good stationery. It's one of the things I taught you. Have good stationery that you can write your thank yous on, even if you're declined and you don't get it. You still write back and say thank you, blah blah
thank you
blah.
for the
Because
time,
that's right.
yada, yada.
But I think it is critical, and it's funny because I told my daughter that too. I said, now after your interviews, even if you don't think they went well, you want to send a thank you note to the people that interviewed. And nowadays, you typically have email notes from somebody, or you know something about them because everything's electronics,
Yeah.
and so you're going through. But I will tell you, yes, I don't think people do it anymore.
Hmm.
Two, yes, I think it's important.
Hmm.
And then finally, I think it sets you apart today,
Yeah,
and
because
it
nobody
reminds
does
them
it.
of you.
Nobody ever
And they may
seems
have
to.
interviewed or done screens on 20 people. The one
Well,
or two people that send something back, they're
and
going to
here's
remember.
this is my weird strategy. I do it a couple hours after
Hmm.
because they're still gonna be normally when you're interviewing for a position, they're interviewing a bunch of people on a
Yes.
day or over multiple days. So what I do is I always wait till the end of working hours
And then
typically.
send
So
it
if
through.
I remember I had a screening call and now that followed up, I have an interview next week with that company I screened with, but I still message that person where they contacted me
Hmm.
through, which in this case was a job recruiter site that they contacted me through. But I made sure to reply and say, hey, thank you for the time. I'm looking forward to the interview. I thought we had a great conversation.
Hmm.
And I did that at the end, I think 5 p.m. I did that
Hmm.
around 5 p.m. So they would either see it at the end of the day before they left or see it the next morning and remind them, oh,
Hmm.
I remember that person. And I think I find that useful
I think
around
it's
those
important.
times.
Yeah.
Because if you send it immediately after, it
It doesn't
doesn't
feel
read
genuine.
quite as good
Yeah.
as wait a little bit and then send it, because
Hmm.
then it makes it, or even if you just schedule it, if it's an email, you can just schedule it
Hmm.
for 5. But yeah, I agree. I think that's something that really needs to be done more
Well, and I
because
think
it's
what would
super
even set that
good.
apart farther, and I'm thinking this is what you were saying, is you thank them for their time, and if you can put something a little bit unique that came out of the interview.
About the
Yeah.
conversation, yeah.
It really impressed me that you have this charity, that you spent the time to tell me more about the charity.
Well,
That meant a
in
lot.
my most recent interview, it was for a STEM like program where we work with kids, and I remember in my follow up, I basically said I'm really looking forward to it. Your schedules that we talked about were really interesting. I think the break ideas and these specific classes we talked about were really cool and something I look forward to.
Hmm.
Those that like reference the
It means something.
specifics.
Yeah.
But this episode is run very long.
Well, it has, and I think we just to kind of summarize it, preparing
Hmm.
is important. Making sure you know what your story is,
Hmm.
and that little bit of an elevator speech you want to get through is important.
Hmm.
And then you got the mechanics that we've talked through a bunch of time: how you interview, how you answer
Well,
questions,
and
blah
you can
blah.
go listen to the art of the interview where we
Yes,
go into more depth
and then
about
making
that.
sure you close it properly. But
Hmm.
I think that is the anatomy of it, and you cannot prep too much, because the more you prep and the more you interview, the better you get.
Hmm.
So even if you don't And my daughter actually said this to me the other day. She said, even if I don't get this job or that job or whatever, I'm getting better every time I interview. And you are.
It's one of those things that it's a skill that it's impossible to be perfect at the first time.
And
Unless you're
everybody's
naturally insane, I
and
guess.
everybody's
But it's
nervous. I want
yeah.
to say that because I think we forget. We think, well, nobody else is as nervous as I am, or I don't hear anybody else say they're nervous. I'm sorry. I don't care how long you've been working. Everybody is a little bit nervous in an interview
Hmm.
because you are putting yourself out there and you want people to like you and you want people to think that you're competent. So we're all nervous. Now, the whole picture them in their underwear and stuff like that, I don't ever think that ever worked. I always would just say, I know more about me than anybody else, so I'm the subject matter expert. It is my job to convey that. But I acknowledge when I would go in, I'm nervous, calm down. It's okay. I would take a minute in the bathroom to collect myself and then I would go in.
Yep.
And that was for much, much later in my career, I was still having those issues. So
Hmm.
it's not like it ever goes away.
All right.
So you're in good company.
Well, thank you all for listening to this episode of Seriously. Next week we'll be talking. Well, we'll see what we'll be talking about next week. I won't say anything. You
Okay.
know, we might reschedule. We might switch around things. Who knows? But we hope this helped people. And if you want to hear more about this, feel free to ask.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have plans for season 3 yet, but hey, maybe
Mm-hmm.
possibly in the future. We'll see.
I would say if you have
But
questions, stick questions in.
oh,
We'd
please,
love
yeah,
to
please
answer
send us
questions
you
online.
can either put them, well, I don't know how many podcasts have, or how many sites have feedback
Oh,
you
that's
can
fair.
do, but you can always go to at Faux Productions on basically any social media, or at Bearwood Media and ask questions there. So feel free to do that. You can find us on LinkedIn and stuff like that if you want to ask questions, or Blue Sky or Twitter or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the whole purpose of this is to help people. So if you have questions that you'd like us to answer, or maybe we could even have somebody come on
For
sometime.
sure.
That would be wonderful too.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. See you all in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.